The isolation ward of Travis County Animal Services sat at the far end of Building C, separated from the main adoption floor by 2 sets of reinforced steel doors and a hallway that smelled permanently of industrial bleach and something older underneath it, something feral and tightly coiled. In Kennel 7, a dog that nobody could name waited in the dark. She had been brought in 5 days ago by 3 animal control officers, 2 of whom had required medical attention before the intake paperwork was even filed. The call had originated from a property manager in East Austin who reported a large dog living in the crawl space beneath a condemned duplex on Weberville Road. What the officers encountered when they arrived was not a stray. It moved with the low, deliberate economy of something that had been trained to assess threats before committing to them. The first catchpole had been grabbed in the dog's jaws and wrenched sideways so violently that Officer Trent Hawley stumbled against a chain-link fence and tore a ligament in his left wrist. The second officer had used a tranquilizer dart from behind the safety of his truck door. It had taken 2 darts. On her intake form, she was listed as Stray 09 female, German Shepherd mix, approximately 4 to 5 years old. 72 pounds, underweight, notable physical condition, multiple healed lacerations across the flanks and hind quarters, 1 significant diagonal scar across the right shoulder blade, consistent with shrapnel or heavy wire, fractured dew claw on the left foreleg, severely malnourished, behavioral status, extreme aggression, unpredictable, isolation required. To the staff of Building C, she was called the Ghost's Dog, because no matter how many times someone approached Kennel 7, no matter how slowly or softly, or with how many treats held out in an open palm, the dog would vanish into the back corner of her enclosure and materialize again only when she chose to, usually right at the gate, low and fast and absolutely silent until she wasn't. Catherine Beale had run Travis County Animal Services for 11 years. She was the kind of woman who drove 40 minutes each way to work every morning and still arrived before her staff, who had a framed photograph of every dog she had ever placed in a home, hundreds of them filling an entire wall of her office, and who had never once, in 11 years, stopped believing that the right person existed for every animal that came through her doors. She stopped believing it on Tuesday when she watched Stray 09 take a running start at the kennel gate and hit the reinforced steel with enough force to bow the frame outward by nearly 2 inches. She's not reacting to fear stimuli, Dr. Patrick Weil told her that same afternoon, his arms crossed over his chest as they stood behind the painted yellow line on the corridor floor. He was the shelter's lead veterinary behaviorist, a careful man who weighed his words before he used them. The dog had made him careful. Watch her posture. She's not cowering. She's not pacing in distress circles. She's doing perimeter work. Catherine watched. The German Shepherd moved the length of her kennel in a tight, controlled pattern, not the frantic back and forth of an anxious animal, but something measured. Intentional. What does that mean exactly? Catherine asked. It means she was trained, Dr. Weil said quietly, significantly trained, and whoever trained her isn't here. They had tried everything. The shelter's certified behavior team had attempted 3 separate low-stress approach protocols. A volunteer with 17 years of rescue experience had brought freeze-dried liver treats and gotten within 6 feet of the gate before Stray 09 hit the chain link with enough force to scatter them across the corridor. A working dog sanctuary in Bastrop had reviewed Dr. Weil's behavioral assessment video and declined. A second organization in San Marcos had done the same. The word liability appeared in both emails. Stray 09 had been given a 48-hour extension beyond the standard holding period, simply because Catherine could not bring herself to schedule it. She had watched a lot of dogs come through this building. She had watched some of them arrive broken and leave whole. She had watched others arrive in a state so profound and unreachable that the kindest thing she could offer them was a quiet room and a gentle hand at the end. But there was something about this dog that sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. It didn't matter. On Wednesday evening, Catherine sat at her desk and signed the euthanasia order. 7:30 Thursday morning. Dr. Weil had promised it would be as peaceful as the circumstances allowed. The pole syringe was the only safe option. She set the pen down, looked at the wall of photographs, and didn't look at them for very long. Inside Kennel 7, the dog who had once been called Specter moved through her patrol pattern in the dark. The smells here were wrong, chemical sharp, and layered with the scent of dozens of unfamiliar animals, none of them allies, none of them threats she'd been briefed on. The humans who came to the yellow line wore soft clothing, and their movements were hesitant, and they smelled of the same chemicals that coated the floor. None of them were her handler. None of them were her unit. Her unit had disappeared into rotor noise and smoke, and the particular quality of silence that follows an explosion, and she had been holding the perimeter ever since, because that was what she had been trained to do when the mission went sideways. You held the ground. You did not abandon the post. She was very tired. Her shoulder ached where the old wound pulled at the scar tissue whenever she moved too quickly. Her paws had developed raw patches from the concrete, but she had been trained to work through pain, and so she worked through it, and she waited. 22 hours later, at 4:58 in the morning, Claire Devlin came awake in her apartment in San Antonio with both hands already gripping the edge of her mattress. The nightmare had come again in the same form it always took, the dust first, that specific brownish-orange wall of pulverized Afghan earth that a secondary ID could throw into the air like a curtain being yanked across a window. Then the ringing, the tinnitus whine in her right ear that had never fully left in the 2 years since Kandahar. And then, through the smoke and the pressure and the weight of the blast against her chest, the image that wouldn't let go, 72 pounds of black and grey German shepherd, pulling a downed insurgent away from Claire's bleeding legs by the sleeve, her tactical harness visible for 1 second through the smoke before the second device detonated, and the dust closed over everything like a fist. Claire sat on the edge of her bed. She breathed. She was 27 years old, and she had been doing this long enough to have gotten better at the breathing part. She pressed her fingers against the scar that ran from her left collarbone to the curve of her shoulder. Shrapnel, same blast, and felt it the way she always did when she first woke up, like a map of something she hadn't finished reading. She was not supposed to have survived the Kandahar ambush. The medevac team had pulled her out of the rubble of a compound wall with a fractured clavicle, 3 broken ribs, a perforated eardrum, and blood loss that had put her into surgery twice before they reached Bagram. When she came back around, she asked about her dog before she asked about her own prognosis. The answer was MEA, pending field assessment. The field assessment was never updated. The official paperwork eventually listed Specter as killed in action, date of incident, theater of operations, case closed. Claire had never accepted it. She was working now as a VA outreach coordinator in San Antonio, a job that suited her the way most things suited her since the discharge, adequately, with room left over for the part of her that was still somewhere in that dust cloud, still looking. The walls of her spare bedroom were covered in printed emails and shipping manifests and contact lists for private military contractors who moved animals internationally. She had spent 18 months and most of her savings on a search that every person in her life had gently, carefully encouraged her to let go of. She had not let go. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand at 5:14. A text from Beckett Rains, a former handler from a different SEAL team who was one of the few people who had taken her search seriously enough to keep watching when she couldn't. Devlin, I know it's early. Pull up the Austin Urgent Rescue page on Facebook. Scroll all the way down. Tell me what you see. She pulled up the page. The post was time-stamped 2:47 a.m. Urgent. Last chance, Travis County. Streamail GSD, severe behavioral designation, euthanasia scheduled 7:30 a.m. Thursday. No rescue available, sharing for awareness. The photo had been taken through chain link mesh in bad lighting, probably a cell phone held at an awkward angle. The dog was in mid-movement, not lunging but shifting her weight, and the frame had caught her in a three-quarter turn toward the camera that exposed the right side of her body. Claire's thumb stopped moving. There, across the right shoulder blade, running diagonally from the top of the scapula toward the mid-back, was a scar, not a small one, not the kind of mark a dog picks up from a fence wire or a rough encounter with another animal. It was wide and settled and healed over in the specific way that shrapnel wounds heal, layered, the fur growing back in a slightly different texture over the site, the line of it more deliberate than accidental. Claire had made that wound herself. Not the shrapnel had done the cutting, but in a forward operating base bathroom with a field medical kit and a headlamp held between her teeth, it had been Claire's hands that cleaned it and closed it and wrapped it, working by red light so as not to compromise the base's light discipline, talking to the dog the entire time in a low, steady voice because Specter responded to her voice the way a compass responds to north. The phone screen blurred. She looked at the time, 5:22 a.m. The shelter was on Cameron Road in Austin, 91 miles. She was in the truck in 4 minutes. The drive north on I-35 had a quality that Claire could not have described to anyone who had not also driven toward something they had spent 2 years believing was gone. The speedometer held at 93. The sky ahead was still deep blue-black at the horizon, and she watched it turn while she drove, and she did not think about the mathematics of it. The miles, the minutes, the margin, because the moment she thought about the mathematics, she would have to consider the possibility that she was wrong, that the scar was coincidental, that she had been looking so long and so hard at the shape of her loss that she had learned to see it everywhere. She didn't think about any of that. She drove. She pulled into the Travis County Animal Services parking lot at 7-Eleven. She left the engine running. The lobby was early morning quiet when she pushed through the front doors, one staff member at the front desk, another visible through a glass partition. Claire walked directly to the desk. She did not shout. She had trained herself out of shouting in tense moments years ago because it wasted time and created resistance. "I need access to Kennel 7 in Building C," she said. "Right now." The young man behind the desk blinked at her. "Ma'am, the facility doesn't open to the public until—" "I'm not the public. I'm the handler of the dog you're about to euthanize." She placed both hands flat on the counter, not as a threat, but as an anchor. "I have 19 minutes. The commotion brought Catherine Beale out of her office. The director was a compact woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the particular expression of someone who has already had a difficult morning and can see it is about to become more so. She took in the situation in a single sweep. The young woman in the lobby, the tactical pants, the scar visible above the collar of her shirt, the quality of forward momentum that Catherine had learned to recognize in people who had been somewhere genuinely dangerous. "I'm the director," Catherine said. "If you're here about the German Shepherd in isolation, I need you to understand that the animal is—" "Her name is Specter." Claire said it the way you say the name of someone standing in the next room. Not past tense, not tentative. "She's a naval K-9 trained by Naval Special Warfare, bonded to me as her designated handler. She disappeared during an ambush in Kandahar province 2 years ago. I've been looking for her since." A pause. "Her microchip is DoD encrypted. Your scanner won't read it. But I can prove she knows me in about 60 seconds if you will take me to that kennel." Catherine held her gaze for a long moment. "Follow me," she said. The walk through Building C was not long enough for what Catherine was carrying, and too long for what Claire was. Officer Hawley fell in behind them. They found Doctor, while already in the isolation corridor, pole syringe in hand, working the geometry of the approach angle with the focused concentration of someone who understood the danger and had decided to proceed anyway. Specter heard them coming before they rounded the corner. The sound she made was not barking. It was lower than that, a sustained rolling warning from deep in the chest that made the fluorescent fixtures in the corridor seem to vibrate slightly. When she saw the humans appear at the far end of the hallway, she hit the gate. The entire frame shuddered. Catherine started. Claire was already moving. She walked straight to Kennel 7 without slowing. Dr. Weil stepped back instinctively. Specter hit the gate a second time, then a third. Her eyes blown wide with defensive fury, her lips pulled back far enough to expose the full length of her teeth. Behind Claire, Officer Hawley pulled a sharp breath and held it. She did not stop. She walked to the gate and lowered herself to her knees on the concrete floor directly in front of the mesh, close enough that the hot air from the dog's snarling reached her face. Specter froze. It was the proximity first. Claire's body didn't carry the cautious geometry of the humans who had come to the yellow line with their careful approaches and averted eyes. She had dropped straight down and stayed, level and close and completely still, and the dog's threat computation caught on that and registered it as something outside the established pattern. Claire exhaled slowly. She did not look away. She raised her right hand, palm facing out, 3 fingers extended, thumb folded. Not a command, but a recognition signal, the specific configuration she had used before every mission debrief, when she needed Specter to understand they were no longer in operational mode. Off the clock. You can come down now. Then she said quietly, Specter wacht. The Dutch command for wait. The specific word, in the specific register, in the specific voice that Specter had heard several hundred times in the context of coming home from somewhere hard. The snarling stopped. Not gradually, not with a slow unwinding. It stopped the way a thrown switch stops current, immediately and completely. Specter's jaws closed. The hackles that had been raised along her spine for 5 solid days dropped flat against her coat in a single long wave, like a curtain finally settling. Her ears rotated slowly forward. She looked at Claire's face. Catherine Beale brought one hand to her mouth and did not speak. Dr. Weil stood against the opposite wall with the pole syringe hanging forgotten from his fingers, his expression one that would take him several days to find adequate language for. Specter. Claire's voice broke on the second syllable. She pressed her forehead against the chain link and felt the cold metal against her skin and stayed there. It's me, girl. I've got you. Wacht, bliff. I'm right here. The German shepherd crossed the kennel floor in 3 steps. She didn't rush. She pressed her nose against the mesh exactly where Claire's forehead rested, and the sound she made then was as nothing that belonged in a county animal services building. It was the high, worn, devastated sound of something that has been holding an unbearable amount of weight for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Open the gate, Claire said. She did not take her eyes from the dog. She could still, Dr. Weil began. Open it, Catherine said. The carabiner gave way. Claire pushed the gate the rest of the way open herself and stepped through, and the German shepherd came apart. All of it. The tactical stillness, the cold precision, the 5 days of holding a perimeter that no one else could even see, all of it dissolved. Specter dropped onto her belly on the concrete and army-crawled the remaining distance and pressed her entire head beneath Claire's arm and did not move. Claire sat down on the floor of Kennel 7 and wrapped both arms around the dog's neck and made no effort to be composed about it. The sound that came out of her had no plan behind it. It came from the same place the nightmares came from, the same place the scar on her collarbone came from, the same place 18 months of unanswered emails had come from. everything she had carried forward from that dust cloud in Kandahar, finally finding somewhere to go. "I looked everywhere," she said into the fur at the back of Specter's neck. She was not speaking to anyone in the corridor. "I looked everywhere. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry." Specter pressed harder against her and exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to come from deeper than her lungs. In the hallway, Officer Hawley did not trust himself to speak. Dr. Whale set the pole syringe on the floor beside him very carefully, as if setting something fragile down, and looked at it for a moment as though uncertain how he had come to be holding it. Catherine stepped quietly back from the kennel gate, put both hands in her pockets, and allowed herself a full minute before she squared her shoulders and went to call the base. The verification took 3.5 hours. A Navy liaison from the Joint Base San Antonio-Lackland complex drove to the shelter with a DoD encrypted scanner and a folder of documentation and confirmed everything Claire had said before his coffee went cold. The chip read out cleanly. The bonded handler designation was on record. The case file, once partially declassified, told the story of how Specter had separated from the medevac site under suppression fire and survived the secondary blast, been recovered by an Allied militia unit with no protocol for military working dogs, and subsequently passed through 3 private contractors over the course of 14 months, each of whom had failed to break her and moved her to the next highest bidder. The final contractor, spooked by a federal investigation into an unrelated smuggling network operating through central Texas, had abandoned her in a stash location on the east side of Austin. She had survived free and feral in the city for an estimated 6 weeks before the property manager on Weberville Road made the call. She had survived all of it. She had held the perimeter. Claire signed the release documents at Catherine's desk, with Specter's head resting across her thighs, the dog's eyes half closed, her breathing finally slow. "I want to say something," Catherine said. She was standing near the window. The morning light had moved considerably since they had first met in the lobby. "We were doing our job as best we could with what we had. But I want to say it anyway, I'm sorry. If we had known what she was—" "You couldn't have," Claire said. "She was doing her job too. She couldn't tell you who she was. That's not how she was trained." She looked down at the dog. "She was trained to wait for me." Dr. Weil spoke from the doorway, his voice carrying the measured quality she had noticed in him earlier, now edged with something else. Respect, maybe. Or the particular humility that comes from being shown something you were certain wasn't possible. "She's going to need significant care, Claire. The shoulder has old adhesion we'll need to address. 2 cracked teeth from the fence, and the psychological work. For both of you, that's not a short road." "I know," Claire said. "We've got time." She said it, the way she might have said we've got the high ground, not casually, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has already done the arithmetic and is satisfied with the result. When they came through the double doors into the main corridor of Building C, the staff of Travis County Animal Services had arranged themselves along both walls without anyone having to ask. Kennel technicians, veterinary assistants, the front desk staff, 2 volunteers who had been on shift when Stray 09 came in 5 days ago. Officer Hawley stood at the far end with his injured wrist still in its brace, his posture unconsciously straight. The young volunteer who had been closest to the gate on the first approach stood near the middle of the hallway, his eyes red at the corners. Nobody spoke. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It was simply what the moment required. Specter walked out of Building C with her head level and her gaze fixed on the glass doors at the far end of the corridor. Her gait, though she favored the old shoulder wound, carried a quality that made Dr. Weil think later, when he wrote about it in the shelter's incident log, of the word deliberate. Not broken, not feral, not stray, something that knew exactly where it was going. Claire paused at the exterior doors. She turned back once and looked at Catherine Beale, who stood where the corridor opened into the lobby, reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead, hands still in her pockets. "Thank you for the extra time," Claire said. "Thank you for knowing where to look," Catherine answered. Outside, the Austin morning was already warm, the kind of thick, bright-edged Texas summer light that seems to come from everywhere at once. Claire pushed through the doors, and it washed over them both, the woman and the dog, stepping out of the antiseptic cool of the building into air that smelled of cedar and heat and the particular openness of a city fully awake. She opened the passenger door of her truck. Specter didn't hesitate. She vaulted into the seat the way she had done 100 times before, in the Nevada desert during training outside the gates at Kandahar, in a dozen parking lots and staging areas that now belonged to a different chapter of both their lives. She turned around twice and settled with her chin on Claire's jacket, which was folded on the seat between them, and closed her amber eyes. Claire sat behind the wheel for a long moment before she started the engine. She put her hand on the dog's back and felt the ribs too close to the surface, the old scar under her palm, the slow rise and fall of a breath that had no urgency in it anymore. There would be a lot of phone calls after this, and a lot of paperwork, and a veterinary appointment that would take most of a day. There would be nights when one or both of them woke in the dark, reaching for something that wasn't there before remembering that now it was. There would be slow walks and careful meals, and the long, patient work of teaching two bodies that the war was truly over. But that was later. Claire Devlin put the truck in reverse, checked her mirrors, and pulled out of the parking lot of Travis County Animal Services with her dog beside her for the first time in 2 years. Specter pressed deeper into the jacket and let her breathing go slower still, and the tension that had lived in her frame for 5 days, for 2 years, finally went out of her completely, muscle by muscle, like a tide going out, and the road south stretched wide and open before them, and neither one of them looked back.